What would make a man choose silence for over 40 years? In 1863, a mysterious stranger washed ashore in Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia. His legs had been freshly amputated, his past a complete mystery, and he never revealed who he was, where he came from, or why he was abandoned on that beach. Locals called him Jerome. Good evening, and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark. I'm your host, K.D. Culpa, a horror author and paranormal researcher based in Regina, Saskatchewan. Each week on the podcast, we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan's past and even go beyond, uncovering dark history, mysteries, urban legends, and sometimes we even get to some monsters. If you're one of the listeners that comes back each week but aren't yet subscribed, please hit that follow button and share it with someone who loves the weird and wonderful. I've got more big guests and haunted deep dives coming your way, so join me now as we explore the unknown and bring life to the ghosts and monsters hiding in the dark. Tonight, we are returning to another Canadian Legends and Monsters feature episode. In this series, we dive into the eerie tales and mythical creatures that roam the vast landscapes of Canada. Our feature this evening is about a mysterious man named Jerome. Before we get into the legend and mystery surrounding him, let's first talk about the sandy beach that he was first discovered on. So tonight's episode is taking us into eastern Canada within Nova Scotia. There you will find a small community known as Sandy Cove, which is where you'll find the Sandy Cove Beach. When I looked up this location on the maps, I was surprised to see that it is on the northwest side of Nova Scotia on a long, narrow peninsula. Apparently, this very narrow piece of land is also very dramatic with steep cliffs and dense woodlands, which always makes a great location for a legend or unusual mystery to start. So the area was originally settled by the Micmac peoples, and in English, the village was called a small sandy cove. White settlers arrived to the area in 1778 and wanted to use it for a fishing village. One of the sources I found stated that the area was probably called Prince William at that time, up until the early 1850s, but then it was changed to Sandy Cove probably around 1857. So the community continued to be primarily focused on fishing and farming, but eventually they even added a small-scale shipbuilding and trade given their location on the water. Apparently, some of the old churches that were built in those years are still standing and used today. One of them was the Church of Nativity, which was built as early as 1844. So that's quite a long time, quite an old church. To this day, the area remains a small, quiet village surrounded by trees and undisturbed nature. Looking at pictures of it and the surrounding small communities definitely makes me want to visit this place, if only for the beautiful landscape. And I think it'd be kind of cool to go stand on Sandy Cove Beach. Fishing also remains the main industry in the community even today, which again, you can definitely tell in the pictures based on, the harbors and the boats and all the pictures that this is a fishing village. Now, given the small, tight-knit community, I can only imagine the surprise that they must have had when Jerome showed up on the nearby beach back in 1863. So, the story about Jerome goes that he was found either in August or September of 1863 on the sandy beach of Sandy Cove. And this is a true story we're diving into, not, some weird mystery that you can't find any proof of. I actually was able to find newspaper articles that kind of talked back to the day. I couldn't find any specifically in the 1860s, although I'm sure they probably do exist, those older ones. But I did find two articles that cover the story from 1905, so only about 40 years later. And even back then, there was some disagreement on the actual date of discovery, although it was a very strong push towards the August 23rd, I think it was. In the first article, they actually mentioned that it was November, so not even the September date. However, then in a follow-up article, someone had written into the newspaper to let them know that the actual date of discovery was August 23rd. Now, you may be wondering why this is some great mystery. You know, a man being discovered on the Sandy Cove beach back in the 1860s. Well, it was because of how he was found, you know, what state he was found in, and also what happened following. So apparently he had been found lying on the beach. Some say near a big rock, and some say moving towards the water, and with both legs amputated above the knees. They felt that the amputation had happened fairly recently, as the stumps were still bandaged and only partially healed, but that the injuries looked to have been completed by probably a skilled surgeon. There was also evidence that he was suffering from cold and exposure to the elements. Now, beside him, apparently they also found water, a tin of biscuits, and some claim a loaf of bread. So it was obvious to those that found him that he had probably been abandoned by some sort of passing ship, given the vicinity to the water, which was commonly, you know, it was quite common for ships to go by. Now, apparently, the day before, there was some claims that there had been sightings of an unfamiliar ship that wasn't common to the area, so the villagers believed that the man had been on that ship the prior evening, only to be abandoned in the night and then discovered in the morning. Now, I did find, like I said, I found these two clippings in the newspaper in 1905, and they do kind of bring some clarity to this because supposedly at that time when this article was written in 1905, the man was still actually alive. So there were still a lot of people that knew about how he was actually found and where he was found, and you know, a lot more of the truth to the story. Whereas more recently, some things have changed slightly. So anyway, I'll read you a little bit of it here in a minute. Now, another kind of part of this mystery is that, well, there's a few different things. So one thing is some claim that he was crawling towards the water, and people at the time believed he might have been trying to end his life because of all the suffering he was going through, or I don't know, maybe he was having some mental health issues based on something that happened that caused his legs to be chopped off. Like there was a lot of speculation that he might have been trying to end his life. And on top of that, when the people found him, he refused to talk to anybody. They weren't sure if he was, you know, truly mute or if he was simply refusing to speak for the rest of his life, like if he had brain damage and had gone mute, or if he couldn't understand them, or if he just simply was insisting on remaining silent. They weren't really too sure, or if maybe it was trauma, like a trauma response. Either way, he was deliberately, like he was refusing to communicate with anybody, no matter what language they spoke to him in. Now, as I said, I'll read you a section I found about the discovery of this man that was reported in the St. John Daily Sun. Now, this was back in September 1905. I mean, in fact, I think it was September 8th, 1905. So maybe that's where the September date came from in some of the more recent articles. But anyway, its title is The Mystery Man of or at Metagan, a story that is stranger than fiction relating to an occurrence in Nova Scotia. Okay, so I'll read you just kind of the first few little paragraphs and then we'll talk about kind of the rest because it's quite a long article. So if you want to read a long article about this, this is the newspaper to check out. All right. On a November afternoon, drearily cold and somewhat misty with fog, the fishermen along Digby Neck, which is the name of the strip of land about 9 miles across the water from Medigan, saw a vessel which tradition has it was a gunboat, enter the bay and skirt the shore. The curiosity of the fishermen was aroused, but the fog was shutting down, and night soon deepening the darkness. No one could find out whether the vessel had anchored or not, and they were obliged to nurse their curiosity with patience until morning. When morning dawned, there was no ship to be seen. It was cold and frosty weather, and none of the poor fisher folk cared to put off in the bay until the day was well advanced and the sun had warmed the nipping air. Sometime during the day, a fisherman drew near to Sandy Cove, which is a deep inlet directly across from Medigan, lying between the precipitous bluffs. With his mind filled with remembrance of the strange visitor of the night before, the fisherman had his eyes sharpened for anything unusual along the coast, and perhaps the great man of war might have sought refuge in the little cove. But no ship loomed in that tiny harbor. Only on the shelving, sandy beach, he saw a curious, dark object. With some fear, he pulled his dory close enough to see that the object was a man, though huddled into what seemed a curious position. With doubt and fear troubling his heart, the fisherman pulled closer to the shore, and then, for a moment, his heart stood still. The shapeless object was a man, but, as he thought at first, a man's body only, a dead hulk without legs, only the stumps of his legs being left. The fisherman departed in haste, and it was toward evening before he found a mate to return with him and investigate more closely the object on the shore of Sandy Cove. As these two poor Frenchmen drew near the bank, they heard the low moaning of the creature on the shore, and they made haste to land and go to his assistance. By the look of the man's garments, he had been an officer on the war vessel, but both his legs were gone above the knees, either shot away in action, as they believed, or amputated clean by a surgeon's knife. The wounds had been lately dressed in a skillful manner. The man was clad, as the story goes, in officer's uniform, and by his side was a bottle of water and a package of sea biscuit. So the article goes on to say that the man was unable to communicate, likely too cold, and could only moan. So they picked him up, got him into their boat, and took him to their home to warm up by the fire on a cot. Eventually went to find a doctor and a priest for the man. The doctor checked his wounds to find that his stumps had been taken clean off above the knees and was skillfully dressed. The priest had managed to eventually get the name Jerome. Some say they even found out a last name, Mahoney, but he refused to give any more answers. Eventually, thanks to the care of the doctor, the man became well enough that he was moved to a family in Medigan. Apparently, he would speak a little to the villagers, but never divulged information about himself. So he wasn't completely mute then, obviously. But he also couldn't hold conversations, and he would grow irritable and even sometimes violent if the questioning or pushing, at him about his past went on too long. Many felt that he spoke just gibberish or just made strange noises that no one could understand. Now, eventually he was left alone. They decided, you know what, they won't push him for his past. They won't push him to find out who he truly is or why he ended up being on the beach with no legs. And instead, the article goes on to say that the man lived with that same original family for 7 years before they then moved him to a new family, which was the family of Joseph Camo, which is where he would then stay for the remainder of his life. And apparently this is like on a farm. Apparently at the time of this article in 1905, like I said, September 1905, Jerome was actually even still alive and well. He was estimated to be over 74 years old at that time, so he had been living there for over 40 years, and they were guessing he was over 74. And he was still living with that family, Joseph Camo. He had been still living with them ever since that original family. He moved from that original family. Now, unfortunately for him, no one knew what language he spoke, even though they had many linguists that would be brought in to visit with him. Now, in this article, the claim is that they felt he was Irish. Remember, this is the September 8th article. Although they tried to have many villagers in the area to speak to him in different language. They tried Gaelic, they tried French, they tried Italian, Spanish, German, and then, of course, English. But he would not respond or acknowledge any of them. Now, the person that wrote the article apparently even claimed to visit Jerome himself, or herself, I'm not sure, finding him to be an elderly man that seemed intelligent but still refused to talk. The author felt strongly that Jerome could actually understand both English and French, but simply refused to respond or acknowledge them. The family he was still living with said that he had previously sat on the deck in the sun on nice days, but in the last 15 years he refused to even leave the house. Instead, he would sit by the stove to stay warm, although they would sometimes hear him pray or talk to himself. So it was likely that he could talk, but he was still choosing not to, even 40 some years later. I did find later another little piece that claimed that they actually started charging people to come visit Jerome. They decided that so many people wanted to visit this man who lost his legs, this mysterious man, that they eventually started charging people entrance fees to actually, try to talk to him. Which, I mean, that would make me angry. So I don't really blame him for never wanting to talk to them, if that's true. Now, anyway, at the end of this September article, and then we'll go into the next one, which kind of disputes some of the facts that they shared. But at the end of this article, the author quotes a young priest that had been trying to communicate with Jerome for years. So I'll read you kind of the last couple of paragraphs. 40 years of silence will obliterate most traces of identity, the young student wisely observed. He pointed out that 40 years ago would be the period of our own civil war. This man may have been a spy, traitor, or have been guilty of some dishonorable act for which he wished to be lost to the world. You can see that he is a man of intelligence and refinement beyond the average, said the young priest. And whenever or whatever is the cause of his silence, it is not likely that it is inability to communicate himself. He would have learned our language before this. He is silent because he wishes to be silent, and no one can break down a will such as his. And so the secret of Jerome is likely to go with him to the grave, and no one will ever know what tragedy preceded the anchoring of that strange vessel in St. Mary's Bay so many years ago. Now, as I mentioned, there was a follow-up article about this strange mystery in the same paper, so the St. John Daily, but in December of 1905. So the second article was titled More About the Man at Medegon. Judge Savory adds to the facts known of this unfortunate foreigner. So apparently a judge in Annapolis had written into the paper at the time after seeing the original article, kind of giving some more information about Jerome that hadn't before been shared with the paper to try and correct some of their facts. So according to this Judge Savory, the man was expected to actually be Italian, not Irish. And it wasn't fishermen that had originally found him, but two men from the village. So I'll read you a small section from this other article so that we can get some more of the supposedly true facts. Judge Savory writes that there never was any halo of romance or tradition surrounding this hapless Italian, who was deserted on the shore at Sandy Cove. The people who first found him there were not fisher folk. Robert Bishop, farmer, merchant, and J.P., and another man, both yet living, were on the hill at Sandy Cove when they saw two small sailing vessels come into the cove, put something in a boat, and send the boat ashore. They thought the vessels were coming for water, but after they had sailed away, a man, half-witted and of defective speech, came running to them and pointing to the shore, said there was a man there with no legs. Mr. Bishop and his friend went and found the stranger propelling himself with his hands, although in a sitting posture, towards the tide which was rising. They stopped him just in time. A lot of the ship's biscuit and a jug of water were high up on the beach, no doubt at the spot where he was first placed. The government, on being informed, secured a Frenchman at Madigan to care for the man. Jerome and Colombo were the only names he would utter. He may be a Portuguese from Colombo, Ceylon, or Colombo may have been the name of the ship he last served in. Again, his own name may be Jerome Colombo. Mr. Mecci, an Italian gentleman residing at Madigan, has often tried to converse with the man, and has succeeded in getting him to say a few words. So apparently it was this Italian, Mr. Mecci, that believed that Jerome was actually an Italian from the Adriatic coast, which apparently would align align with the name Jerome Colombo. This was also when the judge clarified the date of discovery. It was actually August 23rd, 1963, not November and not September, like others have claimed since. And finally, it was the judge's opinion that a story published the previous year about a sailor's story of having to watch another sailor have his legs amputated on a ship near Nova Scotia are likely of Jerome himself. Now, I didn't go and try to find that article yet. I might do that too, because I'm kind of curious what it's about. But anyway, let's kind of go into some of the theories about where they think Jerome came from. Because as you can obviously tell, there has been a lot of speculation about where this mysterious man may have come from or who he could have been before being found on this beach. Now, unfortunately, since this was in the 1800s and he refused to speak, it's probably a bit harder to find the true source of who this man really was. But let's kind of talk about some of the main theories that I found about, who they think he is or what his origin story may have been. So one theory is that he is actually a man by the name of Gamby, or like the nickname Gamby, from Chipman, New Brunswick. So the claim goes that a young foreigner had fallen into the ice in 1859 in Chipman and had developed gangrene in both of his legs, which then required, of course, both of his legs to be amputated by a local doctor. Now, according to what I found out about Gamby from Chipman, is that he was an Italian and was considered to be a burden to the community, so they didn't want to have to, support him anymore. So one night, apparently, a captain had been paid to pick up Gamby and transport him to the opposite side of the bay to Nova Scotia so that he could become someone else's problem. But many feel that this claim is pure fiction, pure speculation, and that the dates don't line up because it is kind of true. If the claim that his amputations were fresh and, still healing, like this would be 4 years later. So I wouldn't think they would still be healing from fresh amputation 4 years later. So anyway, as you can tell from the newspaper clippings, another theory is that Jerome was an officer on a warship, likely having his legs removed due to a war injury, and then had been abandoned by the ship on the water. Although, would this be an Italian warship if he's Italian then? Assuming, that claim of him being Italian is true, or maybe he's Irish, or I don't know. And does this mean he attempted mutiny or some other vicious act that they decided that it would better to be abandoning him than keeping him on the ship? I don't know. And none of this really explains why he would remain silent for 40 years, refusing to divulge who he was. Like, even the theory about Gamby is hard to believe because you would think that he would say, hey, this happened to me from across the water, unless they had, like, threatened him to stay in silence. But even that seems unusual. And like I said, the 4 year discrepancy in the stumps of his legs. So I don't know. That one's kind of a hard one. With the bandages being fresh, that one's a hard one to kind of agree with. Now, apparently, there was even a claim going around that he could have been a lost prince or a nobleman that had gotten into some political trouble and was exiled by his country only to be abandoned at Sandy Cove. Or that maybe he had been a nobleman or prince that had been captured by an enemy country and mutilated and then abandoned for political reasons. So this claim is based on the fact that when he was found, he did not seem to be of a laborer or worker type because he had no calluses on his hands. He seemed very intelligent, likely understanding multiple language. So they think that he was probably an aristocrat or potentially even royalty. So that's kind of where that claim comes from. And apparently, even another piece that adds to the mystery in some people's eyes is that Jerome passed away on April 15th, 1912. So if you know, the same day that the Titanic sank. So, some people say this is a final straw of this mystery, how this, marine mystery in Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia would then pass away the same day that the Titanic tragedy would happen. So they just think that there's some connections in these maritime or in these marine incidents, I guess. So I don't know. Who do you think Jerome was? Do you think he's an officer of war that had been abandoned because of some violent act, or a nobleman that had been used because of some political act, either exiled or kidnapped by an enemy government, or just a man who chose to disappear and live his life in silence, giving up his past life for good. Personally, I have a hard time with the nobleman one just because you'd think that would have been like there would have been newspaper articles or something to link to that. I don't know. But it's an interesting rabbit hole to fall down. And we may never know the truth, but that's what makes this mystery all the more intriguing. Now, if you've heard a different version of the origins of Jerome in Sandy Bay, I'd love to hear them. Or if you have another Canadian legend or monster that you want me to dive into next, then let me know. Thank you for listening to ParaGhoul Paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, then make sure you check out my local YQR Ghost Guide to learn more about the top ghosts and haunted buildings in Regina. Within the free download, you'll learn about who the most famous ghosts of Regina, Saskatchewan are, as well as some of the history behind the most haunted buildings. So head over to my website at kdkulpa.com to get your copy today. And before you go, I just want to say thank you for being here. Every listen, every share, every bit of support helps me take this podcast further. It allows me to interview bigger names in the horror and paranormal world, travel to more haunted places, and create more behind-the-scenes content just for you. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. I'll keep doing my part to make this show something special and spooky just for you. So stay tuned for more episodes where we uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and dive deeper into the shadows. This is Katie Culpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.